So the Western anime community really doesn't know how to talk about doujinshi. I don't mean that nobody in the fandom understands what it is, rather the popular way it's described and portrayed is deeply inaccurate. In fact, many of the terms that we use to describe doujinshi and doujin culture are at their best misleading or at their worst entirely incorrect. Take for example the common usage of doujin as a short form for ero manga, which falsely assumes that the content is pornographic. It isn't. But even the more neutral and seemingly mundane descriptions, such as indie, fan-made, or amateur, fail to properly place doujinshi either, and they don't even really describe the wider ecosystem of doujin works that aren't manga. I want to point these out not because I want to nitpick small semantic errors, but because I think it's a great way to illustrate what makes doujinshi and doujin culture unique. Plus, I think it can bring us closer to Japanese fans and creators. See, doujinshi is in many respects the beating heart of otaku culture, and for many Western fans it only really seems as something auxiliary. You only have to notice that the largest otaku media convention is dedicated to doujin works to see how deeply rooted it is within the fandom. So if we really want to be deep fans of anime and manga, I think it's important that we take doujinshi seriously. So let's go and break down these misconceptions together. So what are some of the concrete things that people get wrong when talking about doujinshi and doujin culture? Well, the first thing to consider is that doujin doesn't refer to any particular medium. Taken from the characters the same in person, doujin describes groups and individuals who share similar tastes and interests and is often translated into like-minded people. The term also describes the particular fan production practices and forms of distribution that these groups operate under. Doujin culture as a whole is much larger than just manga. There are doujin games, doujin anime, doujin music, doujin literature, and various other otaku fandom practices such as cosplay and tabletop role-playing. Doujinshi, on the other hand, simply adds the extra kanji of shi, which represents document. The term originates from the shortening of the early Meiji-era term doujin zashi, literally meaning doujin magazine. Because of this, the most common translation you're likely to find is fanzine, because it fits both the origins of the Japanese term and because we can relate it to comic fanzines in the West. I wish we could simply leave it there, but the big issue with this translation is that one of Comicet's co-founders made a clear distinction between manga doujinshi and doujin fanzines. Manga doujinshi is of course the manga itself, whilst doujin fanzines refer to fan magazines, which aren't necessarily manga. Another popular term to describe doujinshi is fan-made manga, but this description has two major flaws. Firstly, because doujinshi is often used to refer to parody manga, there's a common misconception that doujin is synonymous with fan art. The issue here is that doujinshi aren't inherently derivative works. In fact, the parody doujinshi that we're most familiar with today is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. See, for the majority of doujin's history, doujin culture was entirely composed of original works created by small literary circles. These works were not fan works in the sense that they were parodies of existing media. Instead, these works were original magazines and written stories created by fans of a particular medium or genre. In comparison, parody doujinshi was born from the doujin fairs of the 1970s and 80s, which grew in response to manga becoming the largest site of doujin production. Series such as Space Battleship Yamato, Urusei Yatsura, and Captain Tsubasa caused periodic waves of fan works, ultimately raising parody manga to become a significant and sometimes dominant proportion of doujin works in distribution. In Japanese, there already exists a separate term to describe derivative fan works called niji sosaku, literally secondary creation, and it's often used to distinguish between original and parody doujinshi. Because of this, we can only really consider doujin to be fan art only in the sense that doujin produces are passionate fans of a particular medium, not of particular stories. Funnily enough, there's kind of an interesting parallel going on in Japan with the loan word fan fiction. The term is often used by Japanese scholars and fans to describe doujinshi, but the crucial element is that fan fiction doesn't usually refer to textual fiction created by fans. Instead, the term refers to fan works in general, regardless of their medium. What we would call fan fiction in the West is instead reserved for the term shosetsu, or the shortening of SS. The issue with the term fan-made manga also shows us an issue with the term amateur manga. See, whilst a lot of doujinshi could be considered amateur in contrast to professional, there's quite a few professional creators who create doujin works for themselves. For example, Urobuchi Gen, the writer of Psychopaths and Fate Zero, created his own doujin game called Joka no Monsho, based on the American film Equilibrium. There are even several doujin artists and circles which have elevated themselves to professional groups and organizations, such as the famous shoujo manga group Clamp or the gaming circle Type Moon. There are even several original Dojin titles which have turned into commercial works, such as the Higurashi series or Habanai Renmei. Finally, the last term I want to tackle is indie. See, on the face of it, indie seems to work quite well, and it doesn't run into the issues that our previous examples have. But if it worked, I wouldn't be mentioning it. See, indie, as it's being constructed in Japan, isn't just a descriptive designator for any type of independent work. Instead, it describes various subcultures and production practices within the realms of music, games, and cinema, all with their own separate histories and subcultures. Because of this, we can't simply take our existing understanding of indie and cleanly adapt it into the Japanese context, let alone conflate it with Dojin culture. The biggest example to illustrate this is the distinction between indie and Dojin games in Japan. Unlike Dojin, which has its origins in the Meiji period, indie is a fairly recent term which dates back to the mid-1980s. Indie games in particular emerged as a concept in the mid-2000s, where by contrast, Dojin games have existed since the early 80s on hardware such as the PC 8801 and Sharp X1. Instead of describing independent games broadly, indie indicates a particular ethos and mode of game development from already existing subcultures outside of Japan. It assumes specific commercial and artistic aspirations, its own distribution channels, and its own production methods, including the use of particular game engines and systems. It also doesn't simply signify any game development outside the mainstream or outside of commercial production. Instead, it's considered an entire practice on its own. This is why the phenomena is a loanword rather than a Japanese version of independent games development. The distinction between the two in Japan can be quite stark, considering that indie games have their own separate conventions from Dojin events, and they tend to be far smaller in attendance. If we make a cross-cultural comparison, we'll see various aspects that make the translation of Dojin into indie seem rather problematic. For instance, unlike indie, Dojin culture doesn't position itself against mainstream media. Instead, mainstream media is precisely the object of Dojin culture's shared appreciation. The two also tend to have fairly different commercial aspirations, as Dojin games are predominantly made as a hobbyist venture, whilst indie games are purely professional and entrepreneurial. There are also various other minor details between them. Dojin games tend to be fairly apolitical on the whole, more faithful to retro conventions than indie games, and they also tend to be exclusively made for PCs. With all this being said, it's worth mentioning that the boundaries between the two are not always clear, and there's very little consensus as to how they're actually related both academically and within each other's subcultures. Whilst indie has generally been seen as a foreign and mostly Western phenomena, there's been a recent trend in Japanese gaming communities, including Dojin circles, to adopt the term in search of an international audience. It's common to see popular original Dojin titles being translated into English and marketed internationally as indie rather than Dojin. If you want to learn more about the indie gaming scene in Japan, I highly recommend the French documentary Branch in Parts. It does a good job at explaining the state of indie games in Japan and their relation to Dojin games, showing just how fluid and contradictory the term can be in contrast to Dojin, from the mouth of both indie and Dojin creators. So let's sum up. What I want to highlight is that the way that Western fans commonly describe Doujinshi is either flawed or wrong. Unfortunately, there is no straightforward English phrase or term which correctly expresses how it operates within the larger ecosystem of Japanese popular culture. Doujinshi can be fan art, but many of its works are original creations. It can be fan-made or amateur, but it's also created by professionals, even for their own series. We call them indie to refer to them being independently produced, but that ignores the developing subculture of indie in Japan, which is often set apart from Dojin culture as a whole. It should go without saying that Doujinshi can be erotic as well, but by no means are all of them era manga. Because of this, the way that we should talk about Doujinshi is descriptively, in order to accurately describe what otaku do and don't call Doujinshi. If we don't, we're only going to stray further away from the fans and creators who both make and consume these works. But if you come to the end of this video with only a fuzzy interpretation of Doujinshi, I don't blame you. I've only really outlined the aspects of Doujinshi rather than actually explain it. What I want to do next is make a proper introduction to Dojin culture and explain what makes it unique. See, Doujinshi have a whole system of exchange and production culture unique to it, alongside a long history with surprising twists and turns, which may completely change how you might think about otaku culture as a whole. Currently, Dojin culture is Japan's largest, most misunderstood subculture, so I hope that we can change it together. Okay, so 3 recommendations. If you want an anime that talks about Doujinshi and explains it, try Comic Party. It's alright. I have the game for some reason on Dreamcast. I haven't played it. I just kind of have it. If you want a AniTube recommendation, I would suggest watching Study of Swords video on Princess Mononoke. I almost forgot the name of the fucking movie. And finally, as a great way to say detox from this kind of informational video, something that's kind of relatable, especially to me who's going back to work, you can check out Gil Lyser's AMV, Work is Like a Second Skin. Pretty intense, pretty cool. The guy who made it is incredibly gay, which is great. Yeah, bye.